All right, so this week, how many of you are still recovering from last Easter? Like a week ago, was that not the most amazing thing ever? And so now we lean on Jesus to do another amazing thing this morning, right? Okay, so next week we're going to start a new series that's going to be actually talking about the different ways that God speaks to us through His Word, by His Spirit, even through the supernatural like visions and dreams and utterances of wisdom and prophecy. So we'll be talking about all those things for a few weeks, but that starts next week. This week, today, right now, what we're going to do is we're just going to jump into the gospel and have a little Bible study. You want to do that? Is that all right? We're just going to dig into the gospel and just have a more conversational moment and see what God might speak to our hearts this morning. Joshua chapter 24, beginning in verse 12. God says, "And I sent the hornet before you, which drove them out before you. The two kings of the Amorites, it was not by your sword or by your bow. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities that you had not built, and you dwell in them. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive orchards that you did not plant. Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve Him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Now, I love this text for a host of reasons, one of which is I understand and can quote the last verse a lot. I almost wake up to that verse. But it's interesting that everything that precedes it, I don't seem to know as much. And it's I guess, true that we are very good at making declarations to God. We are very good at telling God, "God, I love you. God, I will serve you." But we don't always know what that means. And since we don't know what it means, we actually have no intention of making good on the promise. It's just a declaration. We get excited. "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." But what are you going to do to serve the Lord? How are you serving the Lord? And this text wakes us up to move beyond a declaration or a promise and actually get very serious about what we're saying. We should know how we are serving the Lord. If somebody says, "Do you serve the Lord?" and you say, "Yes," how do you do that? What do you do in obedience or in service to God? So let's just kind of sit here for a minute, because I love this beginning where he talks about, "I sent the hornet before you that drove them out." You're walking into a place that God says is yours, but somebody is there, but then He sends something that drives them out of the place and makes a way for you. You didn't do it. You didn't earn it. You didn't deserve it. There is a sense of humility that this text forces upon us, because if we're going to approach God, we have to approach Him with humility. Our pride isn't going to work. We're not going to show up to God and show Him and tell Him all the things that we did. We come in thanksgiving for all the things that He did. And so here in this moment, He's like, we're going to start this whole conversation on grace. Grace is what God does all by Himself. He drove them out. Somebody else planted vineyards. You're eating of the fruit, but you didn't plant the vineyard. What is that? That's the grace of God. That is God giving you something that you neither earned nor you deserved, but God all by Himself made a way for you. The only thing we can do when we come to the realization that God did something for us is just thank Him. I have a praise in my mouth constantly because I'm constantly mindful of what God has done for me. That is all that can be done. That's all that can be given, is just a thanksgiving, a praise, a worship for the abundance that God has poured out on us. We also see in this text, though, this conversation about kings. He said there were two kings that you conquered not by your sword or by your bow. And what I want to just lean into for a minute is that it was 2 kings. It wasn't just one. Because for me, I don't want to project this onto you, but sometimes the conquering of the first king, the first battle, is almost the easiest. Because, I'm so dependent on him going into the moment. I know that I can't do it. I depend on him. Then I get into the moment, and he strengthens me, and he makes a way, and on the other side of it, there's now a victory. What happens for me, though, is I look back, and I tend to think about what I did. And then I think that I conquered, that I won. And then the next battle shows up, and the next battle requires more than I have. And now I'm worried about the next battle because I've forgotten actually what really happened in the first battle. And so if we will have full assurance that the same God that delivered us the first time is the same God who will deliver us again, that what God did, he will do, he will always do, then I will constantly lean on his faithfulness. So that it's not just the first king, but it's the second king as well. Joshua had a moment in the presence of Moses when he saw this whole thing come to pass. They had a battle, and they had a battle with the Amorites, and it went really well. They won the battle. Then they get away from that moment, and now another king is coming against them, and now there is fear. Moses has a dread looking into the eyes of the king that's coming against him and looking into the eyes of the army that is coming against him, and they were afraid. And we see this moment in Numbers chapter 21 and verse 34, where God said to Moses, "Do not fear him, for I have given him into your hand, and all of his people and his land. And you shall do to him what you did to Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon." So what he was reminding Moses of was, look, we've seen this before. And I was with you before. And just like I was with you before, I will be with you again. There are moments where there might be insufficiency, and we look at the insufficiency and we are afraid that God won't be faithful. But fear not, for God who was faithful the first time you didn't have enough is the same God who will be faithful again. You might have a sickness in your body and God healed you. He brought you to a place of health before, and you're staring at another, and it's upsetting and it's fearful and you don't know what to do and you're not sure what's going to happen. But I promise you, the same God who delivered you the first time is the same God who will deliver you again. He didn't just give them victory over one king, but he gave them victory over another king. And Joshua saw a similar moment actually in his leadership, and I love this because there's a cool principle in this. So the Numbers 21 reference, I want you to remember that God said, "I will give you the victory over him with your hand. I will give him into your hand." Him, singular, hand, singular. Hold that. Now Joshua has this moment where it isn't one king coming against him, but it's a bunch of kings who are coming against him. And all the people of Israel, and he begins to fear. And he prays this prayer in fear in Joshua chapter 10 and verse 6. He says, "God, all the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the hill country are gathered against us." But God said to Joshua, "Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands, and not one of their men will stand before you." To Moses, he said, "I have given him into your hand." To Joshua, when there were multiple enemies, multiple kings, he said, "I have given them into your hands," plural. There are moments, the victory is the Lord's. Yes. But there are moments where he's requiring more from you in this battle than he required from you in the other battle. And while it's important for us to recognize that it's always by his hand that we have the victory, it is also important to us that when he speaks to us and he says it's going to take this, that we obey. Because what we're really saying is we obeyed the first time according to his word and God delivered. And when we obey the second time according to his word, he will deliver. If he said, I'm going to give him, the enemy, into your hand the first time, then that means it's not going to take all of your resources. But if he says, I'm going to deliver them into your hands, plural, what does that mean? It's going to require more of you this time than was required of you the first time. And sometimes as Christians, we get a little bit lazy because we lean on the grace of God, meaning we lean on the thing he promised to do while neglecting the thing he told us to do. It is all by his grace that we have the victory. But God uses our resource in bringing us to a place of victory. That's what we call faith. And the first battle, he said, your hand. The second battle, he said, your hands. So there might be a moment in your life where you had something you were facing that was troubling to you. And you just simply prayed a prayer, maybe even a simple prayer. And then there was like almost immediate victory. Like it didn't even hardly require patience. Through faith and patience, they obtained the promises. You just asked and God just did it. Like, that's awesome. It's just rare. And now there's this battle, and it's not just faith, but it's faith and patience. Now this battle, you're having to wage differently than you waged the first battle. Did you hear the voice of God and his instruction, and are you willing to give him everything he asked for? Because he asked for a hand in the first battle with Moses, but with Joshua, he said, I need both. Are we willing to be sensitive? Are we willing to be aware of what God is actually asking us to do so that we can see the fullness of the victory? Because I believe God has victory for every single person in this room. I also believe that you waged a war previously that might not have required as much of you as what God is requiring of you today. Sometimes there are prayers that must be prayed over a space of time. It's not just once. It's not just twice. He's going to keep asking you to ask him. And will you be patient and willing to ask because your faith remains in him? See, I've heard people suggest that if you're not asking, that means you believed it the first time. I'm one of these that thinks if you're not asking, you quit believing. I ask the one where my help comes from. If I quit asking the one from whom my help comes from, then where am I looking for my help? So we have these moments where God might be asking more from us. It might have been okay for you to simply pray a prayer at 8 o'clock in the morning on the way to work, and your kid just had a great day at school that day. It just worked. But the next time, he might wake you up at 3 o'clock in the morning and say, this isn't a 5-minute prayer in the car. This is you get out of your bed, go find somewhere, put your head in a pillow, and you need to intercede for a good day for your child. Like, he's not just wanting a victory that you could wage with one hand. He's actually wanting a victory that's being won with two hands. Like, are we willing to do this? Are we willing to do everything that God is asking us to do in order to see the fullness of the victory that he promised to give us? Like that's an opportunity, that's a conversation in this first text with these two kings, because we see him do it two completely different ways. Still God moving, but he moved in different ways. Are we willing to follow him every single time? Or do we get lazy the second time and just want to do whatever we did the first time? Sometimes God is calling you higher. Sometimes God is calling you deeper. Sometimes God is calling you to do more. And in the depths of doing more, not only will you see the victory, but you'll hear from God things you never heard otherwise. Why? Because he said this one is going to take two hands. It's gonna take all of you to have the fullness of victory. We said this last week. And I just want to bring it back in. Luke chapter 10 and verse 19, Jesus said, behold, I have given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you. God has given us the authority, but we have to exercise that authority. We have to move in that authority. And I'm not wrestling against natural kings or political kingdoms, but we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and rulers and spiritual realms. And so it is requiring of us to do spiritual battle. That means there are moments in prayer in the closet where God sees what we pray in secret and he rewards us openly. Are we actually willing to wage that war? Are we actually willing to fight that battle? That's the question. And so he said you had these victories over two kings. You lived in a grace, in a house, in a city. You had all this stuff that you didn't do. So now what? Like, what happens now? Some of you got saved last week. You came into a relationship with Jesus on Easter Sunday, and we are thankful that you had that moment. We are thankful that you are here. Sometimes when people first get saved, they ask me that, they're like, what's the one thing I should be doing? Maybe two. What are two things? Like, people come in, they're new. And they don't know exactly what to do, what not to do. This whole thing is new for them. And what do I tell somebody who's brand new that's the best thing that they can do? Come gather with the church. That's what I tell them. Wait, is that like more important than Bible study? When somebody's brand new, they don't even know how to study the Bible. When Jesus was raised from the dead, there were people who had knowledge of the law, but they had no idea what it meant to him. And Jesus had to walk along beside them and explain to them in the Word all the things that were meant about him. They didn't understand it. We see this moment where Philip saw a young man who was in a chariot, and he was reading the word, and Philip sat with him and said, hey, like, you need me to explain this to you? He says, yeah, I have no idea what any of this means. So he explained it to them. So when people are new into the kingdom, I think it's genius, brilliant, imperative that you come gather with the saints. Hebrews tells us that when you gather with the saints, they will stir you up to love God and people, and they will stir you up to do good works. You need people sort of coaching you along the way. You need people to help you, help explain certain things, because here's what happens. A moment, and I know I'm going to get pushback on this, but a moment is never enough. It's never enough. Let me explain it this way, because I am what would be described as a Christian who is Spirit-filled. Now, every Christian is filled with the Spirit. We've all received the Spirit. But when we make that distinction, what I'm saying is I'm a Christian who believes in the baptism in the Holy Spirit with the evidence of speaking in tongues. I believe in that. I practice that. I believe in spiritual gifts, the gifts of the Spirit, like supernatural gifts of the Spirit. I believe they're in operation today. Like, I believe in them. I'm all in. But here's something that most people like me, Spirit-filled Christians who are Spirit-filled, we tend to sort of elevate miracles and moments all the time. Like, if you pay attention to us, we'll talk a lot about revival and miracles and healing, and like we'll even say stuff like, and God is going to have some massive miraculous move at the end, and all these people are going to come get saved. Here is the problem with our theory. It's never worked that way. Like, it's never, ever worked that way. Like, put a pin to it. Jesus shows up in Bethany. He raises Lazarus from the dead. That's a pretty big miracle. Raised him from the dead. A few weeks later, Jesus is in the same town, and somebody is anointing him for his burial. And they're all mad at Jesus. What? He just did a miracle. Like, the whole town should be gathered and want to hear what he has to say. It didn't work that way. It's never worked that way. Jesus went and performed miracles in the temple after Palm Sunday. And 3 days later, they were the same people that saw the miracles on Monday. The same people were shouting, "Crucify him," on Friday. So when we have this notion that when miracles start popping like popcorn, everybody's just going to come flooding the altars, it's never worked that way. Ever. Okay, let me push into this a little, because now you're annoying me. All right. All right, so here's a moment that Joshua has with Moses. God shows up at the mountain in a cloud, and there's thunder, and there's lightning, and there's the voice of God. And he says, you shall have no idols. Make no idols. They said, okay. We tracking? Yep. Moses is now on the mountain again. They said no idols. Don't answer this. Have you ever over the church seen thunderings and lightnings and heard the voice of God rumbling from the heavens over the sanctuary? Because I haven't. They did. And 40 days later, they were making an idol at the base of the mountain. So don't talk to me about the miraculous is just going to draw in all these people. They'll forget God in 10 days when they saw him move miraculously 10 days before. Jesus told a town, he said, man, if the stuff that was done in front of you was done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented long ago. I'm just proving my point. Sometimes I'm a little heavy-handed. I'm just proving my point. My point has a better point. I just make that one for a minute. All right, here's the better point. Joshua, being fully aware of our tendency to move past moments, said, choose this day who you're going to serve. Like, now you have a choice. You've had a moment. I'm glad you had a moment, but now you have a choice. What is your choice going to be? If your choice is to love God, then I'm telling you, fear him and serve him. There's a lifestyle that must happen because moments are not nearly as transformational as we like them to be. Moments get us started, but then we have to commit to a lifestyle of fearing and serving the Lord. And it's only when we commit to that lifestyle that we become the person that God has called us to be. Because the moment was awesome, but you can see God at the altar on Sunday and you can be cooking up idols on Friday. I thank God for moments, but it's not about the moment. It's about everything that follows. Choose you this day. Choose you. What is going to be your choice? So he says you need to fear and you need to serve the Lord. This is what you need to do. Now, what does it mean to fear the Lord? Because this is one of those that we have conversations about, and some people get a little bit frustrated about it, and some people don't. But when we're talking about fearing the Lord, what does that mean? Jesus gave us a very good definition of fearing the Lord. He said, do not fear the one who can simply kill the body, but fear the one who can condemn your soul to hell. Now, that sounds like fear. As in the way we would all describe fear. Right? Like, if he can send me there, then I fear him. Because he's the one that has more power than anyone else has. And so Proverbs 9:10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So wisdom begins at a certain point. I was watching a guy on TV the other day. He passed away during COVID, Marcus Lamb, but I always enjoy watching him. Not necessarily my style, but I really like this guy. And his altar calls are always like hellfire and brimstone altar calls. Like hell to shun, a heaven to gain. There is a hell and you'll go there if you don't get it right. Like I love his altar calls. They're very, like I almost get saved every time I watch one. This dude can have church on a Sunday night. Now, I don't know if you guys pay attention, but people don't go to church on Sunday night anymore. If you can go to church on a Sunday night, like that's a big deal. So here's a group of like the sanctuary is a third full. It's a Sunday night. I'm watching this. You know, there's nobody there but Christians. Who else goes to church on a Sunday night? Like the whole audience came down and got saved. Why? Because he like really pushed the fear of the Lord. Like we used to be afraid of going to hell. That wasn't a bad thing. Now, people like me, we talk about heaven all the time, the glory of God all the time, because I like to talk about heaven. I don't like to talk about hell. But it's not a bad idea to at least be aware of hell. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But then what do we do with 1 John? Because 1 John 4:16 says it like this to Christians. He says, so now we're in the New Testament. He said, so we have come to know and believe in the love that God has for us. God is love. And so if we will abide in love, then we abide in God, and God abides in us. And by this is love perfected. So by what is love perfected? That we abide in him and he abides in us. So love starts at a point, it has a beginning, but then it is perfected. So it increases, it matures in us. He says, by this, love is perfected. It has to be perfected. And then he moves on and he says, so that we can have confidence in the day of the Lord. Now, here in the middle of a conversation about love, he's talking about the day of the Lord. What does he mean by the day of the Lord? The day that God comes and judges the world, and he says, you are mine, and you spend eternity with me. You are not mine. You're damned to hell for eternity. That's the day of the Lord. So in the middle of a conversation about love, we're talking about people going to hell. But he says, we who understand love, we have confidence for the day of the Lord. And then he goes on, and he says, there is no fear in love, for perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears has not been perfected by love. So now we're forced to kind of wrestle with the tension of the fear of the Lord and the love of God. Like, if I'm in the fullness of the love of God, why does that mean I don't fear him anymore? Perfect love it has a foundation that is inclusive of the fear of the Lord, but not being afraid of judgment that's coming. What does that mean? That means love has to be perfected. Now, let me just give a metaphor, because sometimes language can be a little bit confusing. Has anybody ever been water skiing? It's okay. I mean, it's a little heavy, but can you be honest? Has anybody ever been water skiing? Yes, thank you. Okay. How many of you have watched someone water ski? Oh, even better. Okay, some of y'all need to get out more. It's like Florida. It's Florida. All right, whatever. Alligators, I know. I was on a walk yesterday. There's like 25 alligators. It was the most amazing thing. I saw one had a head 3 feet long. 3 feet long. Massive. So I understand. I was over by Lake Hancock, but it's one of the Panther Trail. There's like these, anyhow, whatever, over there. All right, here's my thing. If you like to get in the water, if you want to understand like water skiing. All right, if you understand water skiing and somebody that wants to learn how to slalom, they will teach them how to slalom. They'll start on 2 skis. Nobody starts on 1. You start on 2. You learn how to ski. And then you learn how to slalom. And the way that you learn how to slalom, at least the way they taught us how to slalom, that's going to work for the example here is, once you were comfortable on 2, and you'd kind of lean into 1, you'd kind of get used to this, then you would cast off this ski and settle into your slalom ski. You start here. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I don't want to go to hell. I don't want to be there. So I want to follow God. I understand who he is. The more I'm with him, though, I understand aspects and layers of God that I didn't understand at the beginning. And so as I come into the fullness of the love of God, now there's a fear of him that I'm not afraid anymore. And perfect love casts off fear. And now we're in that ski. What is that ski? It's in being in the love of God. I'm abiding here in the love of God. And when I abide here, I have no fear for judgment. Why? Because I am in him. I am serving him. And I know that in that place, he has given me a promise that I will actually be lifted up on Judgment Day, not cast down. So I have confidence in what his word says to me. I'm not confused because I know what he said. Like we have to understand that things start in a disciplinary manner, and that's okay. Whom the Lord loves, he what? He corrects. It's a little bit like kids. There was this thing parents used to do in parenting. It was called discipline. And discipline was a way that you would curb bad behavior. Like you would see bad behavior in your children and you would do something that would curb the bad behavior. So that as they matured, as they grew up, they were the person that they should be. Because if you just let somebody raise themselves in the woods with zero oversight and you go back into the woods in 20 years, that is going to be a mess. So what brings us from a mess to a decent human? Correction, instruction. Like that's how we get there. Now, I don't know, like have you ever been out to eat with somebody and their kids were terrible? I mean terrible. Like you're at a restaurant, you're trying to hear what the person's telling you, but their kid next to them is just, ah! And you're like, I don't know what you're saying because I can't, can you do something? Can you say, like somebody say something? No? Okay. So, like, we as parents are instructed to instruct them. And when they don't heed instruction, there are consequences. And the consequences curb the bad behavior so that they will be a person that will live a life on a path that will lead them to success. Here's what I've noticed about the devil. He doesn't correct me when I do something stupid. He actually encourages me to do something stupid, because when I'm encouraged to do something stupid, I will do it more often. As I do it more often, I'm more the person that I shouldn't be. I'm a person who's walking on a pathway that's going to lead me to destruction. Satan, actually, that's his whole entire goal. He wants to destroy me. So he has no desire to curb bad behavior because that's going to lead me to destruction. Whereas God will discipline me, he will chasten me, he will bring his word in my life and say, absolutely not. And I'll be very uncomfortable with the conviction, not the condemnation, but the conviction. The Word of God will convict me. The Word of God will straighten me out. The Word of God will put me back on the path that leads to life. Why? Because God loves me, so he corrects me to put me in a direction that is going to lead to success, because he delights in the prosperity of his servants. When we don't discipline our children, we are parenting from a position of the other side, because we don't long for their success. We long for their comfort. And comfortable isn't going to lead us to success. It's going to lead us to destruction. So when I understand the fear of the Lord, like when I grasp it, then I understand, oh, he is greater, he is stronger, he is higher. He has a desire for my life, and I need to walk on that path. The more I walk on that path, the more I understand and walk in the love of God. The more I understand the love of God and live in the love of God, I'm not afraid of what will happen. Like when we had kids at a restaurant and they were 2 or 3 and they did something stupid, they'd look like, am I about to get it? Why? Why did they think that was about to happen? Because they knew what they did. Now, when they're 12, they can sit at a restaurant and we can all laugh and have a good time, and they might even laugh out a little too loud and bring it right back. Why? Because they don't have a fear of what's going to happen, because they've moved beyond that. They've become the person that they should be becoming. So they sit at the table without a fear of punishment. They're just enjoying that daddy's paying the bill for dinner. They're just sitting in the blessing of God. They're sitting in the goodness of God, right? Like it's something that if we didn't teach them from 2 to 12, it's going to be really hard when they're 25 coming into the knowledge of God. And now, is God just this big slot machine that gives me whatever I want, keeps me comfortable, and never ever corrects me? Like we teach them their relationship with him when we parent according to the gospel. Like when we do it that way, they will understand fear. But that fear will mature and be replaced or overwhelmed by love. But what was the beginning? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so we see this very, very clearly articulated in John. And this is something interesting too. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But what did James say in James chapter 1 and verse 5? He said, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. What does that mean? That means when you are living in a lifestyle, in a position of fearing the Lord, of loving God, when you're in that place and you ask for wisdom, he gives it to you. When you're living outside of wisdom, you can't even hear the voice of God. Right? So we have to be in position to hear him. What is that position? The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And so there has to be that beginning, but that beginning will mature. And so Joshua is saying here, the fear of the Lord matters, and then he moves on and he says, you need to serve the Lord. Now, when he talks about serving God, this is where we kind of go into his lifestyle and just sort of watch it evolve and mature from the time that they came out of Egypt until the time that they walked into the promised land. And what we see Joshua doing in the beginning years, what we see him doing in this moment is actually serving Moses. John tells us, if you don't love people who you see, how can you love God who you don't see? If you don't serve people who you see, how can you serve God whom you don't see? This is why Jesus said, whoever wants to be great among you must first be your servant, because you have to serve in order to learn how to lead. The person who has never served has no capacity for leadership. None. Why? Because we don't gain it through learning about leadership, we gain it by serving. That's the gospel model. Now, there are other ways to power. There are other ways to leadership. There's just not another gospel way. We'll let all the pundits talk about the other ways to get you to a place of leadership. I'm talking about the gospel way. How does God get you to the place that he's called you to be? Through serving. And we see this in the life of Joshua. Joshua served Moses. He did what Moses asked him to do. So if we kind of jump in through here and we'll kind of work our way. In Exodus chapter 17, there is this war where now they're going to have to go to battle. Now, keep in mind that when God led them out of Egypt, he didn't lead them into battle first because he said they're not strong enough. They won't know what to do. I don't want them to become overwhelmed and then in fear retreat back to Egypt. So he led them the long way where there wasn't opposition so that they could learn to hear him, learn to trust him, learn to depend on him. And then once they were at a place where they could depend on God, then there would be opposition that they would be ready for. But they weren't ready yet. So they take this long, winding way. Now they come to a place where on the road there's opposition. Here's what I need you to understand. He was leading them in pathways of no opposition. Now all of a sudden there's opposition. If that happened in 2023, all the people around Moses would be saying, why did you lead us here? Why did you bring us to this place? Why didn't you? There was a better road. There was a road that didn't involve this. There's a road that didn't involve that. There's a road that, why are we doing this? We should have done this. But what did God say? Go this way. He was leading them by a cloud by day and fire by night. Moses was following. God brought them to this place. Nobody's arguing with Moses about this. What does Moses say to Joshua? We see it in chapter 17 and verse 10. He said, go, put an army together and fight against Amalek. So Joshua did as Moses told him to do. Verse 13, and Joshua overwhelmed Amalek. Joshua led a battle in submission to Moses. Joshua experienced the thrill of winning the battle. Why? Because he submitted first. Sometimes we aren't seeing victories at work. We aren't seeing little promotions at work. We're not winning at work because we're not submitting to the people whom God has placed us under. Let me just say this. God doesn't give you leadership strategies in a position of following. He'll give you strategies to follow. He'll give you strategies to help, but he's not going to tell you how to lead something that he didn't put you in a position to lead. When we step outside of the position that we have, what we're going to do is now argue with the person whom God has placed us under, and rather than serve them, we're going to complain about them, and then we're going to quit our assignment well before we ever satisfied our assignment. This is happening all the time, all over the place. I'm not saying this because this is a popular thing to say. I'm saying it because I'm trying to help somebody. If God has put you in a place and there is somebody on a hierarchical chart that is above you, then serve them. Serve them. Help them win. And you will see things that you would have never seen otherwise. And here's what I promise you. If the time comes for you to be elevated to a place of leadership, with that elevation will come a spiritual gift of leadership, and you'll have everything that you need to have and need to know in order to lead well. But when you learn too soon something that you don't need right now, here's the problem. It's out of date by the time it's your turn. Like, let me say it like this, because I was a little bit of an arrogant follower. So take it from an arrogant follower. When I was in my 20s, I knew everything. Now I just know most things. I knew everything back then. And I followed all this leadership stuff that none of my leaders were doing. Now, here is the problem. I was learning all about leading me, how people should lead me. I'm learning all about leading Gen X. When I finally came to a position of leadership in my late 30s, early 40s, I wasn't leading Gen X. I don't know if you've paid attention, but the way that boomers worked is different than the way that Gen X works, is different than the way that millennials work, which is different than the emerging Gen Z works. If I learned how to lead Gen X well because I was learning all about leadership when I should have been learning how to follow, the problem was I had all these great strategies that now they're completely irrelevant because that's not who I'm leading. So what did I do? I wasted my time learning how to lead when I should have been learning how to better follow. Had I spent the time learning how to be mentored rather than how to lead, I wouldn't have spent as much time judging my leaders. Rather, I would have served them better. Just take it from me. There's a better way to learn. How did Joshua learn to be the leader God called him to be? By serving Moses. Moses said, go to battle. Joshua said, yes, sir. He went to battle, he won the victory, he saw the victory, and he continued to assist Moses over and over and over and over again. Every time Joshua's name is given in the word, what follows is the assistant of Moses. Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant. Joshua, Moses' assistant, son of Nun. It never ends. Why? Because he served who God placed him to serve. That's a big deal. Some of you are called to serve at work, but you're called to lead at home. You need to start leading at home and serving at work. Some of you're called to lead at work, but you're called to serve at home. You need to learn how to serve at home and not lead at home. You need to lead at work where you have a position to lead, and you need to serve at home where you have a position to serve. You'll never, ever mature. You'll never grow out of serving. There will always be somewhere for you to serve. The question is, do you do that well? Joshua, before he ever was a leader, before he ever led well, he served beautifully. And then here's what we see in this principle. Because he served so well, now we see this kind of pop up in Exodus 24:13. It said, Moses rose up with his assistant Joshua and went up into the mountain of God. Joshua wasn't invited into the mountain. Moses was invited to the mountain, but he took Joshua with him because Joshua was indisposable. He gave so much value to Moses that Moses wasn't going anywhere without him. When you serve well, you will go places you never would have gone otherwise. Why? Because you will be included at tables that otherwise you would have never been invited to sit at younger ages, at positions that doesn't seem to make sense. But when you serve well, God is going to lift you up. Moses went up. He took Joshua with him. We need to add value. Like we as people, when we are places, we need to add value. I have conversations with people almost regularly, and they make life so personal. Oh, they don't like me, so they don't. It might not be that they don't like you. You might be a hassle. Like sometimes we are more of a hassle than we should be, so we don't get included in things. Why? Because it's just too much work. It's just too much work to include that person at the table with that conversation. They just introduce too much confusion. They just complain too much. You have to add a lot of value to be included. Joshua added value. Look, my family doesn't leave me on vacation because I add value. No, like for real. Like who's going to pump gas in the car? Who's going to do that? I'm going to do that every single time. Who's going to load all the luggage? Who's going to carry all the heavy stuff? I'm going to. When somebody tries to cheat somebody, who's going to have it out with somebody at the counter? I'm going to. When they forget a registration, when they forget a reservation, who's going to deal with it? I'm going to deal with it. If the rental car has a flat tire, who's going to change the tire? I'm going to change the tire. They can't go anywhere without me. I add far too much value. I'm dead serious. Like, Ab doesn't need me to plan a vacation. She's a fantastic planner. She doesn't even need my opinions. She can plan the best vacation ever. She still needs me. Still needs me. But then there are parts of me that I have to curb. There are parts of me that I have to learn how to temper because they're not good on vacation. I'm a little bit of a neat knack. I don't like mess. Like when I get somewhere, I don't live out of the suitcase. I put everything in my drawers and I put the suitcase away in the back of the corner. Like it looks like I live there. I just move in. I love snacks. I love getting a lot of snacks. I stop and get snacks. Kids love snacks. It's great. Again, they love having me. But here's the thing. Like when you bring the snacks to the car in a bag and you distribute the snacks, when you're finished with the snack, the empty wrapper should go back in the bag. That's where the wrapper goes. The wrapper doesn't go on the floor under your feet. And why we stuff a wrapper in between the seats? Why do humans do this? Like it's gonna go away. Like it's compost. We're just gonna put it right in the, why? Okay, but I have to learn to not be like that in the car. Why? Because even though I add value, I can also create a lot of stress. I have to learn to not create stress on the vacation and just add value. So we pull up to places to get more snacks, and I say, y'all go, I'll be right in there in a minute. And they get out and they all pile into the store, and then I just start cleaning up all the trash. I just clean it all up. I brush the seats out. It looks decent. I throw it away. And then I walk in. I have to deal with me. I have to deal with me. Let me tell you about Joshua. I really want this to register. At just before year 3, they went into the promised land, 10 of them, and they came back, and 8 said no. There were 12. There were 10 that said no. There were 2 that said yes. 12 spies, 10 said no, 2 said yes. Joshua said yes. Joshua said yes. Once it happened as it happened, then God said to Moses, then we'll wander. There's not one complaint from the mouth of Joshua to the one he served and said, Moses, why are we doing this? Why are we wandering around? I've seen the same stupid rock 7 times for the last 10 years. We're walking in circle after circle after circle. There's no chance, not without a massive spiritual overhaul, there is no chance I'd have been able to do that. No chance. For 37 plus years, Joshua served Moses walking in a circle when he wanted to go to the promised land. Why? Because God did not call him to lead yet. God called him to serve, and he served willingly and he served wonderfully. This is why he gives us the command, serve with sincerity and faithfulness. That means you're not doing it for promotion. That means you're not doing it out of flattery. That means what you're saying, you actually believe. What you are doing is to actually add value to the person. And that is what doing something with sincerity means. And then he says, and faithfulness. So that what that means is the thing that you're doing with sincerity, keep doing. Yeah, but we've been doing this for 5 years with faithfulness. We've been doing this 7 years with faithfulness. We've been doing this 10 years with faithfulness. And here's the thing that we also see. Joshua had a love for the presence of God. In Exodus 33:11, we have this moment where God came down over the tent. Moses and Joshua went in. God is speaking to Moses. When that was going on, all the children of Israel would stand at the doorway of their tents, their homes, and they would just watch into the center of their camp where the cloud had descended upon the tent. And then when God was done speaking, it said Moses came out. At chapter 33, verse 11 of Exodus, Moses turned again to the camp to tell them what God had said. But Joshua, the assistant of Moses, a young man, would not depart from the tent. He wasn't just serving. He was having an experience in the presence of God. Like when we are doing the thing that God calls us to do, we will have experiences that we would never otherwise have. When we are living in obedience and service to the one who has called us, we will have an experience of his presence. We will have these moments of refreshing. We will have these moments where God just lets us know you're doing the right thing. Because here's the thing about the presence of God. If it's nothing else, it's a reminder that you're doing the thing you're supposed to be doing. When you feel his presence upon you in the middle of a pathway, in the middle of a job, in the middle of a walk, in the middle of your home, then what that says is God is with you. And if God is with you, then he will lead you and keep leading you. So keep following him. Joshua served and he was led. And he enjoyed the presence of God. So how did it all end? How did it end for Joshua? How did he go out of service? We know he led the people. When did that happen? Joshua 1:1. I absolutely love the progression of this text. It says, the Lord said to Joshua. Now that didn't mean anything to you right then, because you didn't spend the last 4 days reading through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But when you read through all of those, you're not going to see one time God say anything to Joshua. God spoke to Moses. The Lord spoke to Moses. God said to Moses. God said to Moses. God said to Moses 82 times. The Lord spoke to Moses. Never once did he say anything to Joshua. But now we make it to Joshua 1:1. The Lord said to Moses. There are some of you have been waiting patiently for God to speak to you and God to give you direction. And when you will follow him according to the pathway that he has set before you, when you step to the end of that pathway, he will be faithful to speak. And what you have not heard, you will hear. See, there's a moment where when we follow and we do what we're supposed to be doing, when we come to the end of that, there's something else that God has for us. And when we come to the something else, in that moment, God speaks. The Lord said to Joshua, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, Moses, my servant. That is how I want God to describe me. Like, I see it throughout the New Testament. I get it. We are children of God. I am a son of God. I am a child of God, yes. But there's just something when I read through the epistles and it's Paul and a servant of God. James, a servant of God. Peter, a servant of God. There was something about our forefathers that they prided in being a servant of God. It was something of a badge of honor for them to serve God. We've gotten so snippy about being children of God that we have forgotten to literally take joy in being a servant of God. Shawn Scarborough, a slave of God. God can do with me what God wants to do. God can point me in any direction he wants to point me in. He can ask of me. He can command me. He can tell me. He can demand. I'm a slave of God. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now you, Joshua, go over the river Jordan, and you take this people with you into the land that I have given them. And just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. And I will never leave you, and I will never, ever, ever forsake you. And you will cause this people to experience the inheritance that I swore to their fathers to give to them. And then he goes on. He says, this book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth, but you will meditate on it day and night, that you may be careful to do according to all that is written therein. Then you will make your way prosperous. Then you will have good success. In other words, you've served Moses, now I'm telling you to serve me. You have done the thing that you were called to do, now you have to step into the next thing. And the way that you followed me here is the same way that you're gonna follow me now. But you're gonna have a greater experience of my word than you've ever had, because unlike me speaking to Moses and you overhearing, guess what, Joshua? I will speak to you. And so this is what we see. Moses leads the children of Israel out of the wilderness, across the Jordan River. The thing that he wanted to do 37 years before. Hold that. 37 years before, it's exactly what he wanted to do. But because the people weren't ready, God had to say no. But Joshua stayed ready. We need to stay faithful. We need to stay faithful, because any promise that God has ever made to you, he'll bring it to pass. It's not too late. You're not too old. If there's a promise that God has made you, if you've been faithful, you will experience the fullness of the promise. Joshua said, let's go. They said no. 37 years later, God said, let's go. Let's go. And so they went. And it said that they conquered the entirety of the land that God had given to them. And then we see this moment in Joshua chapter 24. After what we just read, we see this moment. It said, so Joshua told all the people, go, the land is yours. You get this, you get this, you get this, you get this. Their inheritance, he gave them their inheritance. And then it says, after these things. In other words, after Joshua obeying all that God commanded him to do, it said, after these things, Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord. What was he throughout all of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy? Joshua, the assistant of Moses. What was he at the end of Joshua? Joshua, the servant of the Lord, died when he was 110 years old. And Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua. As for me, like I will serve the Lord. As for me, I will fear the Lord. I will demonstrate what this looks like. As for me first and my house, we will serve the Lord.